What if TJ's absence isn't just a quiet exit, but the setup for something much bigger? And if he does return, would we even recognize the life he's built in the meantime? Because the more I look at the current story, the more it feels like something important is missing from the picture. I keep coming back to one question that the show hasn't directly answered. Where does TJ truly fit into the current emotional landscape of Port Charles? Not in terms of past presence, but in terms of narrative necessity. Because when I look at Molly moving forward with Cody, building something new, something that feels surprisingly stable, it creates a kind of imbalance. And I don't mean that as a criticism of Molly's arc. In fact, what stands out here is how naturally her story seems to have shifted away from TJ, as if years of connection were quietly folded away without consequence. And that's where things start to feel just a bit too convenient. From a character psychology perspective, Molly isn't someone who easily detaches from long-term emotional bonds. Her history suggests she processes, she reflects, she carries weight. So the idea that TJ, someone who is central to her identity for decades, has simply faded into the background raises a deeper question. Is this intentional narrative silence or a setup for disruption? Because if it's the latter, then TJ's absence might actually be more important than his presence ever was. Now, layer in Jordan. Unlike Molly, Jordan doesn't have the luxury of emotional closure. TJ isn't just a former partner or a chapter in her life, he's her son. And one interesting detail is that the show has subtly maintained the idea that she's still in contact with him. That thread hasn't been cut. It hasn't even been loosened. It's still there, just off screen. And that tells me something. It suggests that TJ hasn't been erased from the world of General Hospital. He's simply been repositioned outside the frame. Which leads me to the possibility that his return, if it happens, wouldn't feel like a reintroduction, but more like a collision. Now, let's consider the context surrounding Jordan's current situation. She's seriously injured, vulnerable, possibly facing a moment where family matters more than anything else. And in storytelling terms, moments like this usually act as emotional magnets. They pull key characters back into orbit. So it makes me wonder if TJ's return isn't just possible, but narratively necessary. But here's where things get complicated. The actor, Taj Bello, has already exited the role. And realistically, that limits the kind of return we might expect. A short cameo feels unlikely. A brief reappearance without long-term commitment wouldn't carry enough weight to justify the build-up. So if TJ comes back, it probably won't be the same TJ we remember. And I don't just mean emotionally. I mean physically. A recast. Now, recasting is always tricky, especially for a character as established as TJ. But there's something about this situation that makes it feel almost fitting. Because the TJ who left Port Charles isn't necessarily the same person who would return. Think about it. If TJ has been working with Doctors Without Borders, exposing himself to crisis zones, life and death situations, global instability, that kind of experience doesn't just change your perspective. It reshapes your identity. So bringing him back with a different face might actually reinforce that transformation rather than undermine it. It could visually signal that time has passed, that growth has occurred, that this version of TJ carries a life we haven't seen. And that's where my theory starts to take shape. What if TJ doesn't come back alone? Because the more I think about it, the more it feels like his absence has created space for something new to exist off screen. Something we haven't been shown, but might eventually be revealed. A relationship, a family, maybe even a child. Now, I'm not saying this is guaranteed, but there's a possibility that during his time away, TJ built a life that doesn't include Molly anymore. And if that's true, then his return wouldn't just be emotional, it would be disruptive on multiple levels. Especially for Molly, because while she seems to have moved on with Cody, that kind of closure can sometimes be fragile. It holds as long as the past stays in the past. But the moment that past walks back into the room changed, evolved, carrying new attachments, it forces a reevaluation. And that reevaluation doesn't have to be romantic. It could be psychological. It could be about identity, about who Molly was with TJ versus who she is now without him. And I find myself wondering, what happens if those two versions of her don't fully align? Now let's take that a step further. If TJ returns with a wife, or even just a serious partner, it introduces a new dynamic that General Hospital hasn't explored with him before. He's always been defined in relation to Molly. So separating him from that identity and placing him in a completely different emotional context could open up a new layer of storytelling. But more importantly, it could challenge the assumptions that both characters and the audience have been holding on to. Because there's something subtle about long-term relationships that end quietly. They leave behind unfinished emotional threads. Not dramatic ones, not explosive ones, but quiet, unresolved questions. What if things had gone differently? What if timing had been better? What if they had tried again? And those questions don't disappear just because someone moves on. They linger. So if TJ returns with a fully formed life partner, child, responsibilities, it doesn't just close the door on Molly. It reframes their entire history. And that's where the narrative potential becomes really interesting, because it shifts the focus from will they reunite to what do they mean to each other now? And that's a much more complex question. Now, bringing this back to Jordan, her condition might be the emotional catalyst that brings TJ back. But what makes this particularly interesting is how that return could ripple outward. Jordan would likely be the first point of connection, the reason TJ comes back, the emotional anchor that grounds his re-entry into Port Charles. But once he's there, he doesn't exist in isolation. He intersects with Molly, with the past, with the version of himself that once belonged to this town. And if that version no longer matches who he is now, then every interaction becomes layered, potentially uncomfortable, possibly revealing, because there's always a gap between who someone was and who they've become. And when that gap is filled with years we didn't witness, it creates a kind of narrative tension that can't be resolved quickly. Now, I also want to address something that might seem contradictory. If TJ has truly moved on emotionally, relationally, then why bring him back at all? Why disrupt Molly's current storyline? Why introduce complexity where there's already stability? And the answer might lie in the nature of soap storytelling itself. Stability is rarely the end goal. It's a temporary state, a baseline that exists so it can be challenged. So if Molly and Cody are currently building something steady, something promising, that might actually be the perfect moment to introduce uncertainty. Not to destroy what they have, but to test it, to see if it holds under pressure. And TJ's return, especially with a new life, could be that pressure. Not because he wants to interfere, but because his mere presence changes the emotional equation. Now, I'm also considering the possibility that TJ's return might not be immediate. It could be delayed, built up through mentions, through updates from Jordan, through subtle hints that something has changed. And then, when he finally appears, it lands with more impact. Because we've had time to anticipate it, to question it, to imagine what he might have become. And if the show chooses to recast him, that delay becomes even more important. It allows the audience to adjust to the idea before confronting the reality. Now, there's another angle here that I think is worth exploring. What if TJ's return isn't entirely voluntary? What if it's driven by necessity rather than choice? Jordan's condition could be serious enough that he feels obligated to come back, even if his life elsewhere is complicated. And that kind of reluctant return adds another layer of tension, because it suggests that TJ might be torn between two worlds, the one he built and the one he left behind. And that internal conflict could shape how he interacts with everyone in Port Charles, including Molly, because if there are still unresolved feelings on either side, they don't have to lead to reconciliation. They could lead to discomfort, to distance, to moments where both characters realize that they've changed in ways that no longer align. And that realization can be just as powerful as a reunion. Now, I'll be honest, there's a part of me that wonders if we're not seeing the full picture yet. Because the show has been careful not to close the door completely on TJ. He hasn't been written off in a definitive way. He hasn't been given a final goodbye. And in soap storytelling, that kind of ambiguity usually means one thing. The story isn't over. It's just paused. So when I look at all these elements, the off-screen presence, Jordan's condition, Molly's new relationship, the possibility of a recast, it starts to form a pattern, not a confirmation, but a direction. A sense that TJ's return, if it happens, won't be about revisiting the past. It'll be about redefining it and possibly challenging the idea that moving on always means moving forward. Because sometimes it just means moving differently. And when those different paths cross again, they don't always lead where we expect. So the real question isn't just, will TJ come back? It's who will he be when he does? And maybe more importantly, what will that mean for everyone else? What do you think? Am I the only one who feels like his absence is setting up something bigger than we've been led to believe? Because right now, it feels less like an ending and more like a setup waiting to unfold. This analysis is based on current story developments and remains a speculative interpretation, not a confirmed outcome.